For 10 years, I drove a rusted 1998 Honda Civic to our annual family reunion, letting my aunt hand me a $20 bill out of pity. What they didn't know was that the cracked phone in my thrift store jacket was fielding Silicon Valley acquisition offers worth over $90 million. There is a specific kind of humiliation reserved for the poor relative at a wealthy family gathering. It's not usually outright cruelty, it's the soft, condescending pity. It's the way they over-explain basic financial concepts to you. It's the extra scoop of potato salad they force onto your paper plate because they assume you haven't eaten a hot meal all week. For as long as I could remember, I was that relative. My name is Leo. When I was 16, my father, the creative, irresponsible black sheep of the family, passed away from a sudden heart attack, leaving my mother and me with a mountain of medical debt and zero life insurance. My father's older brother, Uncle Richard, was the polar opposite. Richard owned a wildly successful commercial real estate development firm in Connecticut. He lived in a sprawling 8-bedroom estate in Cape Cod, drove cars that cost more than my mother's house, and never ever let anyone forget it. When Dad died, Richard stepped in. He paid for my mother's rent for 6 months and covered my tuition at a local community college. It was a lifeline, but it came with a price tag of eternal subservience. Every Thanksgiving, every 4th of July barbecue, every Christmas, I was reminded of my place. I was the charity case, the fixer-upper, the cautionary tale Richard pointed to when lecturing his own son Brandon. See, Brandon? Richard would boom over the patio grill, flipping a $40 steak while I sat quietly with my hot dog. This is why you don't chase passions like your uncle did. You build tangible assets, otherwise you end up needing handouts. I spent my early 20s in a damp, windowless basement apartment in Boston, while Brandon was handed a junior vice president title at his father's firm, straight out of a private university he barely graduated from. I was teaching myself software architecture. I worked the night shift at a hotel front desk, spending the quiet hours between 1000 AM and 5 AM writing code. I lived on ramen, generic brand peanut butter, and sheer spiteful determination. I met my business partner Gabe in a dingy online forum for back-end developers. Gabe was a brilliant, socially anxious data engineer from Chicago, who saw the same massive, glaring hole in the logistics industry that I did. Middle-mile supply chain management was a disaster. Large companies were using outdated, fragmented software from the early 2000s to track millions of dollars in freight. Together, we built FreightFlow. It wasn't a sexy social media app. It wasn't a sleek consumer product. It was a heavy-duty, deeply complex B2B SaaS, software-as-a-service platform that integrated with legacy trucking systems to optimize route efficiency and reduce fuel waste. The first thing she truly noticed, not the swaggering and truly noticed. We pitched to over 80 venture capitalists and got 80 identical rejections. During this time, the family reunions were torture. I was broke. My shoes had holes in them. Still doing the little computer repair gig, Leo? Aunt Brenda would ask, sipping her $80 Chardonnay, eyeing my faded flannel shirt. You know, Richard's firm is looking for a junior IT guy to fix the printers. I could ask him to pull a string for you. It pays $15 an hour. It's a start. I'm okay, Aunt Brenda. I would smile tightly. My project is starting to pick up. Brandon, leaning against the marble kitchen island in his tailored polo, would inevitably snort. A project isn't a job, man. At some point, you gotta grow up. I just closed a $2 million commercial lease in Stamford. What did you close? A pop-up ad. I bite my tongue until it bled. I smiled. I nodded. I ate their food and let them feel superior. And then, in our 4th year, everything changed. We managed to secure a pilot program with a mid-sized regional grocer. Our software saved them 14% in fuel costs in the first quarter. Word spread. Within 6 months, we signed a national retail chain, then a massive freight company out of Texas. Revenue didn't just climb, it exploded. We raised a $12 million Series A led by a quiet, heavyweight angel investor named Thomas Wright. Overnight, my life transformed, but as I looked at the 7-figure balance finally sitting in my personal bank account, a cold, calculated thought settled into my brain. If I told Uncle Richard, he would immediately claim credit. He would say his community college tuition money was the seed capital and demand equity. Aunt Brenda would suddenly expect me to fund Brandon's lavish lifestyle. The dynamic wouldn't change into respect. It would devolve into toxic entitlement and lawsuits. So I decided to do something radical. I decided to lie. I bought a stunning minimalist penthouse in downtown Boston through a blind trust. I bought a sleek Audi RS7 for my daily life, but I kept my rusted 1998 Honda Civic, and I kept my old cheap wardrobe. As far as the world was concerned, Leo, the CEO of Freightflow, was a phantom who rarely gave interviews. And as far as my family was concerned, Leo, the nephew, was still struggling to pay rent. Maintaining the illusion became a masterclass in psychological endurance. By the time the 7th annual family reunion rolled around, Freightflow was a juggernaut. We had hit $35 million in annual recurring revenue ARR. We had a sprawling office in Boston with 150 employees. I was personally worth just south of $40 million on paper, with 8 figures sitting liquid across various diversified accounts. The reunion that year was hosted by Brandon. Thanks to his father's nepotism, Brandon had been promoted to senior VP and had just purchased a massive soulless McMansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. I pulled up to the gated driveway in my '98 Honda Civic. The muffler rattled loudly as I parked between Brandon's leased Porsche 901 and Uncle Richard's brand-new Mercedes S-Class. I killed the engine, grabbed my Tupperware container of store-bought potato salad, and adjusted my 5-year-old slightly frayed jacket. I took a deep breath, mentally stepping into the character of poor cousin Leo. The mud. I walked onto the backyard patio. The show began. "Leo, good to see you, buddy," Brandon shouted from the outdoor bar, holding a craft beer. He looked me up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "See the new house? 5 beds, 6 baths. Took a lot of grinding to get here, but hard work pays off. You still living in that basement?" "No, I moved," I said truthfully. I just didn't mention the move was to a $5 million penthouse overlooking the skyline. "Got a bit more space now." "Good for you," Uncle Richard interrupted, striding over with a cigar clumped between his teeth. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing a little too hard. "Glad to hear you're not totally stagnant. Though leaving that eyesore of the car in Brandon's driveway. You could have parked on the street, son. It ruins the aesthetic of the property." "Sorry, Uncle Richard. I'll move it later." Aunt Brenda swooped in, smelling of expensive perfume and cheap gossip. "Leo, sweetheart, come sit. I was just talking to Susan from the country club. Her daughter is a dental hygienist, very stable income. She's not too picky about looks or financial background. I think it would be a great match for you." "I'm pretty focused on work right now, Aunt Brenda," I said, taking a seat on a plush outdoor sofa. Richard scoffed, blowing smoke into the air. "Work? You're still messing around with that computer stuff." "Leo, I'm going to give you some real advice. In the real world, you need tangible results. You need infrastructure. You need logistics." The word logistics almost made me choke on my ginger ale. "Speaking of logistics," Brandon chimed in, leaning forward, eager to sound like a titan of industry. "Dad, we need to talk about the Q3 margins on the raw material shipments for the new Hartford development. The old dispatch system is bleeding us dry. We had 3 trucks sitting idle in a yard for 2 days last week." Uncle Richard waved his hand dismissively. "I already handled it. My CFO finally convinced me to modernize. We signed a contract on Friday with some tech firm out of Boston. supposed to automate the entire supply chain and track the fleets in real time. I froze. A weird tingling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. "What's the company?" Brandon asked. "Something Flow." "Freight Flow," Richard said, mispronouncing it slightly. "Expensive as all hell. They're gouging us for $120,000 a year just for the enterprise licensing. It's robbery. These tech kids type a few lines of code and think they deserve a fortune. But the CFO swears it'll save us $500,000 in operational waste." I sat perfectly still. The plastic cup in my hand crinkled slightly under my grip. Uncle Richard, the man who had held a community college tuition over my head for a decade, the man who constantly belittled my little computer gig. He had just signed a $120,000 annual contract to use my software. He was paying my company. I was essentially his vendor and his savior. $120,000, Brandon whistled. "Man, we are in the wrong business. Imagine scamming companies out of that kind of cash for an app. It's not a scam if it saves you $500,000, is it?" I said quietly. Both men turned to look at me. The silence on the patio was sudden and heavy. Richard's eyes narrowed, clearly offended that the charity case had dared to speak up about a high-level business matter. "Excuse me, Leo," Richard said, his tone icy. "I'm just saying," I continued, keeping my voice mild, playing the innocent fool. "If the software fixes the idle truck problem, it sounds like an investment, not an expense. You're paying for efficiency." Richard rolled his eyes and turned back to Brandon. "Listen to him. Reads one article on Forbes.com and thinks he's Warren Buffett. Stick to fixing routers, Leo. Let the adults handle corporate finance." Just then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It wasn't the burner phone I usually brought to family events. I had accidentally brought my primary device. I pulled it out. The screen flashed with an encrypted message from Gabe. "Gabe E. The ink is dry. European expansion is greenlit. We just acquired the UK logistics network. Valuation just crossed 150 million. Drinks on you tonight." I stared at the screen. $150 million. I looked up at Brandon, who was aggressively adjusting his Rolex to make sure I saw it. I looked at Uncle Richard, who was complaining about how the government taxed wealth creators like him too heavily. I felt a genuine, unbridled smile spread across my face. It wasn't a tight, forced smile. It was a smile of pure, absolute victory. "What are you grinning at?" Brandon snapped, irritated by my sudden good mood. "Someone offer you a shift as a barista?" "No," I said, sliding the phone back into my pocket. I stood up, stretching my arms. "Just got a nice text from a friend. Hey, Brandon, toss me your keys. I'll move my car out to the street so it doesn't ruin your driveway's aesthetic." Brandon smirked, tossing me the heavy Porsche key fob. "Be careful, Leo. Don't scratch my paint. It costs more than your life." I caught the keys. "Don't worry," I said softly, turning toward the driveway. "I know exactly how much things are worth." 18 months after that backyard barbecue in Connecticut, the economic landscape violently shifted. Interest rates skyrocketed, commercial real estate markets began to freeze, and the easy money that had fueled decades of unchecked arrogance in the development sector dried up almost overnight. At Freight Flow, we were insulated. Our software was essentially recession-proof because when the economy tightens, massive corporations become desperate to cut operational waste. Our revenue soared to $60 million ARR. I had just moved our corporate headquarters to the top 3 floors of a sleek, glass-paneled skyscraper in Boston's financial district. We had over 400 employees. I was flying to London and Tokyo to negotiate international rollouts. But Uncle Richard's firm, Crestview Developments, was drowning. I knew this because I was watching them drown from a high-definition dashboard in my corner office. It started with a flagged account. Gabe, my co-founder, walked into my office on a rainy Tuesday morning holding a tablet. "Hey, Leo, you remember that regional real estate firm out of Hartford? Crestview, the one we onboarded almost 2 years ago." I remember them, I said, leaning back in my chair, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. They're in serious breach of contract, Gabe explained, tapping the screen. They haven't paid their enterprise licensing fees in 8 months. It's not just the software fees either. They opted into our freight financing program, and they've defaulted on $3 million in short-term logistics credit. Their supply chain is a disaster. Their CFO, a guy named Davis Coleman, keeps begging our accounts receivable team for an extension. He claims they have a major cash flow crisis because a $50 million project in Hartford is completely stalled. Stalled why? I asked. Gross mismanagement, Gabe scoffed. Whoever is running their procurement is an idiot. They ordered 3,000 tons of structural steel from a supplier in Ohio, but failed to secure the staging ground or the permits in Hartford. The steel has been sitting on our client trucks and in temporary rail yards for 2 months, racking up astronomical holding fees. They are bleeding roughly $50,000 a day just in penalties. A slow, cold realization washed over me. Brandon. This was Brandon's project. He had bragged about the Hartford development at the family reunion. He had been so busy playing the hotshot executive, buying luxury cars and McMansions, that he hadn't bothered to actually manage the logistics of his own multi-million-dollar site. What's our standard protocol, Gabe? I asked. Standard protocol is we lock them out of the software, freeze their freight assets, and send it to our legal team to file a lien against their properties to recoup the $3 million, Gabe said flatly. But Davis Coleman is practically in tears. He's begging for a sit-down with our executive board. He says if we lock them out, Crestview goes into Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Friday. They want to propose a debt restructuring or potentially sell us their proprietary logistics warehouses in New England to cover the debt. I swiveled my chair, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray Boston skyline. For 10 years, Uncle Richard had made me the punchline of his life. He had used my father's death to elevate his own ego, holding a few $1,000s in community college tuition over my head like a crown of thorns. He had conditioned his son to view me as a peasant. Now his financial life was literally sitting on a server that I own. Set up the meeting, I said quietly. Gabe looked surprised. Really? Usually we just let the lawyers handle these mid-tier defaults. You want to waste your time on them? It's not a waste of time, I replied, a small, dark smile touching the corners of my mouth. Tell Mr. Coleman that the CEO of FreightFlow will personally hear their restructuring pitch. Friday morning, 10 a.m. And Gabe? Make sure he brings the owner of the company and the project manager. I want Richard and Brandon in the room. Gabe nodded, oblivious to the decades of family history simmering beneath my request. Done. I'll have security clear them. The next 3 days were a masterclass in anticipation. I didn't reach out to my family. I didn't drop any hints. Aunt Brenda actually left a voicemail on my burner phone on Thursday afternoon, reminding me that the annual family reunion was coming up in 2 weeks and asking if I could bring those cheap little paper plates you always buy. I listened to the voicemail while sitting in the back of my chauffeured Maybach, entirely surreal. Friday morning arrived. I didn't wear my thrift store flannel. I put on a bespoke charcoal gray Zegna suit that cost more than the Honda Civic I used to park in their driveways. I wore a Patek Philippe watch that Thomas Wright, our lead investor, had gifted me when we crossed the $100 million valuation mark. I stood in the center of FreightFlow's executive boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating space. A 20-foot table carved from a single slab of reclaimed black walnut dominated the room, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. The walls were pure, soundproofed glass, offering a dizzying view of the city below. At 9:55 a.m., my executive assistant Sarah walked in. "Mr. CEO," she said with a polite smile, "the delegation from Crestview Developments is here. Richard, Brandon, and Davis Coleman. Send them in, Sarah, I said, turning my back to the door and looking out the window. And hold all my calls. The heavy oak door clicked open. I heard the scuffling of expensive leather shoes on the polished concrete floor. Wow, I heard Brandon whisper, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. Dad, look at this place. These tech guys are printing money. Look at that view. Focus, Brandon. Richard hissed, his voice tight with an anxiety I had never heard before. He sounded older, thinner. We aren't here to admire the real estate. We are here to beg for our financial lives. Let Coleman do the talking, and for God's sake, look apologetic. I still don't understand why the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm wants to meet with us personally. Davis Coleman muttered nervously, shuffling a stack of manila folders. Usually this is handled by mid-level risk managers. He must be furious about the default. Just lay out the warehouse equity offer, Richard snapped. We give them the Stamford logistics hub. They wipe the $3 million in debt, and we live to fight another day. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of the moment settle into my bones. Then I turned around. The silence that hit the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and entirely deafening. Richard froze, his hand hovering over the back of a leather chair. His face, usually flushed with arrogant confidence, drained of all color. He looked like he had just been struck by lightning. Brandon blinked rapidly, his mouth falling slightly open. He looked at me, looked at the expensive suit, looked at the massive glass desk, and then looked back at me, his brain visibly short-circuited, trying to process the visual information. Davis Coleman, who had never met me, was the only one who moved. He stepped forward, extending a hand. Mr. CEO, I'm Davis Coleman, CFO of Crestview. I know who you are, Davis, I said, my voice calm, projecting effortlessly across the room. I didn't take his hand. I walked slowly to the head of the walnut table and sat down, steepling my fingers. Have a seat, gentlemen. Coleman sat down, confused by the tension. Richard and Brandon remained standing, paralyzed. Leo? Richard finally managed to choke out. His voice was barely a whisper. What are you doing here? How did you get in here? Brandon suddenly barked a harsh, nervous laugh. Oh, I get it. You work here. Aunt Brenda said you were still doing computer stuff. What? Are you the IT guy fixing the projector for the meeting? Listen, Leo, we need you to step out. We're waiting for the boss. This is grown-up business. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I simply reached forward and pressed a button on the intercom console. Sarah, could you bring in the Crestview default file? The one with my signature on the asset seizure authorization. Right away, Mr. CEO, Sarah's voice chimed back perfectly. Brandon's laugh died in his throat. He stumbled backward slightly, bumping into the glass wall. Mr. CEO? Freight Flow, I said softly, letting the name hang in the air. Founded 5 years ago in a basement apartment in Boston. You know the basement you used to joke about at Thanksgiving, Brandon? We just passed a $300 million valuation. I own 51% of the voting shares. This is my company. You are in my building, and you, Uncle Richard, owe me $3.2 million. Richard collapsed into the chair. He literally lost the strength in his legs. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving. You... the software. The vendor. That's right, I said, leaning forward. When you were bragging about paying $120,000 for an enterprise license, you were paying me. When you were mocking me for not having tangible assets, I was buying the digital infrastructure that your entire tangible empire relied upon. I turned my gaze to Brandon, who was now trembling. And then there's you, the senior VP. Davis, why don't you explain to Brandon why we're having this meeting? Coleman, looking frantically between me and my relatives, cleared his throat. Sir, Brandon. Brandon failed to secure the Hartford permits. The steel shipments have been racking up default fees on Freight Flow's network for 60 days. We are functionally insolvent because of the penalties. Insolvent? I repeated the word, tasting it. I looked at Uncle Richard. Do you remember what you told me when my father died? You said that people who don't build assets end up needing handouts. You said I was a charity case. Leo, please, Richard whispered, raising a trembling hand. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, naked desperation. We're family. I paid for your college. I put a roof over your mother's head. You owe me. I paid you back for the college tuition 3 years ago through an anonymous cashier's check, I stated coldly. And I bought my mother a house in Sedona last year. But you're right. You did help me once. Which is why I'm not going to let you go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Relief washed over Richard's face. Brandon had had a massive breath, a smug little smile threatening to return to his face. Thanks, man. I knew you wouldn't screw over your own blood. I'm not screwing you over. I'm executing a hostile takeover, I corrected him. I slid a thick legal document across the table. I am denying your request for a debt restructuring. Instead, Freight Flow is purchasing the entirety of Crestview Development's logistics division, including your warehouses in Stamford, for $3.2 million. The exact amount you owe me. Richard gasped. That division is worth $12 million. You're stealing it for pennies. I'm buying distressed assets at a market-appropriate discount, I replied, quoting a phrase Richard had used for years. If you don't sign, I freeze your accounts at noon, place a lien on your personal estate in Cape Cod, and you file for bankruptcy by Monday. You lose the company, your house, and your legacy. You can't do this, Brandon yelled, slamming his hand on the table. I'm the VP of that division. I looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. Not anymore, Brandon. As of my acquisition of the division, your position is eliminated. You're fired. You might want to update your resume. I hear Aunt Brenda knows someone looking for a dental hygienist. The room was dead silent. I handed a Mont Blanc pen to my uncle. Richard stared at the pen for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at his ruined son, his horrified CFO, and finally at the poor relative sitting at the head of the table. With a shaking hand, Uncle Richard took the pen and signed away his empire. I took the paperwork back, closed the folder, and stood up. Sarah will validate your parking, I said, walking toward the door. Oh, and Uncle Richard, I won't be making it to the family reunion this year. I'm afraid I'm entirely out of cheap paper plates. Nah. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't a screaming match. It's a silent, undeniable signature on a hostile takeover document. I built an empire in the shadows while they built a house of cards in the spotlight. If my story of ultimate vindication resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder to keep grinding, and subscribe for more real-life business drama.